It was an ordinary morning at the airport. The hum of travelers rushing through security, the announcements echoing through the terminals, and the familiar sounds of rolling suitcases filled the air. Among the passengers, there was one man who stood out, not because of his attire, but because of the aura he carried. He was a man of stature, his uniform sharp, and his presence commanding respect. This man was a general, a decorated officer who had spent years of his life leading troops in battle, making difficult decisions, and earning the admiration of both his peers and those who served under him. He walked through the busy airport terminal with purpose. His eyes scanned the surroundings, always alert, as if he were back on the battlefield. His uniform, a symbol of his commitment and hard work, carried a sense of pride, one that he wore not to draw attention, but because it was part of who he was. His past was full of hard-fought victories, long nights of strategizing, and countless sacrifices. Yet today, he wasn't heading to a war zone or a military briefing. Today, he was just a man traveling, trying to get from one place to another. He had a flight to catch, a direct route to a meeting that was crucial to his future. It wasn't about the mission anymore, but about maintaining his position and ensuring that his voice was heard. As he approached the check-in counter, the attendant smiled politely, her face lit up with a warm greeting. But as soon as she looked at his face, there was something else in her expression, a subtle shift in her demeanor, something almost hesitant, though she quickly hid it with a professional smile. She handed him his boarding pass and directed him toward the first-class area. He nodded, acknowledging her, and walked through the gates, his shoes clicking against the polished floors. The first-class section was just ahead, a place of comfort and quiet luxury. As he walked closer, he noticed a few passengers already settled in their plush seats, some reading newspapers, others with headphones on, lost in their own worlds. The general approached the attendant at the entrance of first class. There was a moment of pause before the attendant spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I'm sorry, sir, but it seems we don't have any available seats in this section for you at the moment," she said, her words caught somewhere between apology and an attempt to stick to the airline's policy. The general raised an eyebrow, unsure if he had heard her correctly. The seat next to the window was empty, and he could clearly see that there were plenty of seats available. He waited, giving her a moment, but the situation felt odd. She repeated her words again, offering no explanation, just a firm decision. Her eyes were downcast as she spoke, avoiding his gaze. The general stood there for a moment, his mind processing the situation. Something didn't feel right. Was this truly just a mistake, or was there something more at play? Behind him, a voice came from one of the first-class seats, a man who had been watching the whole exchange. The man's voice was loud enough for the general to hear clearly, yet not enough to be considered a shout. It was a condescending remark, one that seemed aimed at questioning the general's right to be in first class. The man chuckled to himself, oblivious to the man he was insulting. The general's gaze shifted slightly toward the source of the voice, but he didn't react immediately. He had faced challenges before, and this wasn't the first time someone had made assumptions about him based on his appearance. The general took a slow, deliberate breath. He wasn't a man who reacted rashly. His military training had taught him to keep his composure, even when things weren't fair or just. He stood tall, his gaze unwavering, ready to deal with whatever came next. This was a test of character, but he had been through harder ones before. Little did the man in first class know, the general was about to teach him a lesson that would stay with him forever. The general's calm demeanor remained intact, but inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The flight attendant's discomfort, the man's rude remark, it all added up to something more than just a misunderstanding. He chose not to react immediately, understanding that some situations required careful thought before responding. As he stood there, weighing his options, he caught a glimpse of the man who had spoken behind him. The man had a smug expression on his face, clearly enjoying the discomfort of the general and perhaps the situation itself. The general's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in a deep sense of knowing. He had seen people like this before, people who thought their place in the world was secured by something superficial, something as fleeting as status or wealth. This man, sitting in his first-class seat, seemed to believe that his position in life made him superior to others, even to someone like the general. He was unaware of who he was speaking to, and this ignorance would be his undoing. As the general turned to leave, the man in first class couldn't resist speaking again. "I don't know why they let people like you in first class," he muttered just loud enough for the general to hear. The words were coated with judgment, but they didn't have the desired effect. The general didn't flinch, didn't show any sign of being rattled. Instead, he took a deep breath and walked back toward the attendant. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, charged with the tension of what was happening. The attendant seemed uncomfortable, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She wasn't sure how to proceed. The general looked at her, his voice calm but firm. "I'd like to speak to the manager," he said. His tone wasn't angry, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. The flight attendant hesitated for a second, clearly caught in the middle of something she hadn't expected. But then she nodded and went off to get the manager. Meanwhile, the man in first class sat back in his seat, still unaware of the storm he had unwittingly stirred. He adjusted his tie, trying to appear dignified, oblivious to the growing unease among the other passengers who had overheard his comments. The general, meanwhile, simply waited. His patience was his strength. He knew that the situation would play out the way it was meant to, but he also knew that this moment could be pivotal for more than just himself. It was a moment that might change how others saw the world around them. As the manager walked toward the general, he couldn't help but feel a sense of justice in the air. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about respect and dignity, things that everyone deserved, no matter who they were or where they came from. The general was calm, his voice steady, but the moment of truth was coming closer. The racist man still hadn't realized what was about to unfold, and when the truth did hit him, it would be something he would never forget. As the minutes passed, the general remained seated, his posture straight and composed. He had no intention of letting this minor inconvenience disturb his peace. The noise of the airport around him faded as he focused on the manager who was about to approach. He had dealt with far greater challenges during his military career, and this, although irritating, was nothing more than a test of his character. The general knew that sometimes the most powerful responses came not from anger, but from silence and patience. The manager arrived shortly, a middle-aged man who appeared both calm and professional. His uniform was crisp, his face neutral, but there was a glimmer of concern in his eyes as he approached the general. "Sir, I understand there's an issue with your seat assignment," the manager said, his voice respectful yet unsure of how to handle the situation. He glanced toward the first-class section, where the man who had made the rude remarks was now tapping away on his phone, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. The general looked up at the manager, his expression unwavering. "Yes, there seems to be a misunderstanding. I've been denied access to my seat, despite there being plenty of room," he explained calmly. The manager nodded, taking note of the general's composed tone and steady demeanor. "I apologize for the inconvenience, sir. Let me see what I can do," he said, clearly not fully aware of the dynamics that had led to this point. The general's gaze shifted for a moment, not out of frustration but to assess the situation in a broader sense. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions quickly, but the rudeness of the man in first class had been clear from the start. The general could sense the arrogance in the air, and it was a familiar feeling, one he had encountered many times during his years in service, where people's positions in society often blinded them to the value and dignity of others. As the manager went to check the system, the general looked back at the man in first class, who was still oblivious to the growing tension around him. He could hear the faint murmur of other passengers in the background, their whispers growing louder with each passing moment. Some passengers had noticed the incident, and it didn't take long before others began to take sides. The quiet discomfort was building, and it was evident that the man who had disrespected the general was now becoming the subject of attention, not in the way he had hoped. The general's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the manager returning. He had a new level of respect in his voice as he spoke. "I've spoken to our staff, and we're prepared to move you to the first-class section, as originally requested," the manager said, now fully understanding the situation. The general stood up, his eyes briefly meeting the manager's, giving him a silent acknowledgement. But before he could make his way to his seat, the racist man finally looked up from his phone, catching a glimpse of the general's uniform. There was a moment of recognition, but it was too late. The general had already made up his mind about the situation. His journey to the first-class seat wasn't about proving a point to anyone. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully his. He wasn't going to allow someone's misplaced judgment to ruin his day or his trip. As he walked past the man, their eyes briefly locked. The arrogant smirk that had once been present on the man's face began to fade, replaced by a look of confusion. The general's eyes, however, remained steady, filled with quiet confidence. As the general took his seat, the atmosphere in first class shifted. It was as if the entire cabin had been holding its breath, waiting for the moment of truth. The passengers who had been witnesses to this exchange now understood that what had seemed like a trivial incident was much more significant than they had first thought. The respect that the general carried with him, both in how he handled the situation and in his unspoken demeanor, made a lasting impression on everyone. The man who had caused the problem was left in silence, unsure of how to react to the realization that he had just made a fool of himself. As the general settled into his first-class seat, the cabin felt a little quieter, a little more tense. The moments that followed were filled with the subtle sounds of passengers shifting in their seats and the soft whir of the airplane's engines. For most, the issue had already been resolved, but the underlying tension remained. The man in the first-class seat, who had once seemed so confident, now sat unnervingly still. His earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by a sense of discomfort that he couldn't seem to shake off. The general glanced around the cabin. He wasn't interested in causing a scene or drawing more attention to himself, but the reality of the situation weighed on him. It was clear that something had shifted, not just in the atmosphere, but in the way people were viewing the encounter. The man who had made the rude comment now shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to avoid the eyes of the other passengers. Some of them had begun to whisper, their voices barely audible over the hum of the airplane. The general's presence had brought a sudden quiet to the cabin, and the once lively chatter seemed to fade into the background. As the flight went on, the general remained composed, his posture as straight and dignified as ever. He opened a book, but his mind kept wandering back to the situation. He couldn't help but wonder what had driven the man to make such an assumption about him. Why did he think it was acceptable to speak to another person in such a way, without knowing anything about them? The general had faced difficult situations during his time in the military, but this was different. This wasn't about strategy or tactics. It was about something more personal, more human. It was about respect, and the way people chose to treat one another. Despite the initial tension, the general didn't let the incident ruin his peace. He'd learned long ago that the only thing within his control was his response to the world around him. And today, he had chosen to respond with quiet dignity. The man in the seat across from him, however, hadn't quite figured out what had just transpired. He was still wrestling with the reality of what had happened, and it was clear that his mind was racing, trying to justify his actions. The man shifted again, looking down at his phone, as if hoping that the digital world could offer him an escape from his own discomfort. But it was no use. The passengers around him had already noticed his behavior and were beginning to form their own opinions. Some exchanged glances, while others simply shook their heads, realizing that the situation had revealed far more than just a disagreement over a seat. The flight attendant, who had witnessed the entire exchange, couldn't help but feel a bit embarrassed. She had been caught in the middle of the situation and had, in a way, become part of it. But now, seeing the general's calm response and the man's increasing unease, she began to feel a sense of pride. The general's quiet strength had made it clear that his dignity was something that no one could take away from him, not even with rude words or unjust assumptions. As the hours passed, the cabin slowly settled into a new normal. The general continued to read, his mind now focused on the journey ahead. He knew that once the plane landed, this encounter would be over, just a fleeting moment in time. But for the man who had made the rude comment, the lesson would stick with him far longer. How long it would take for him to fully understand the weight of his actions, the general couldn't say. But one thing was certain. The man would think twice the next time he decided to judge someone based solely on appearances. And perhaps, just perhaps, the world would be a little better for it. The hours passed as the flight continued on its course, but the tension in the first-class cabin had not entirely dissipated. As the general sat back in his seat, lost in thought, the man who had made the rude comments earlier seemed more and more uncomfortable. Every so often, the man would glance over at the general, but each time he did, his gaze would quickly shift away. It was as if he was trying to avoid the reality of what he had done, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape it. The general had already made his point, and now the weight of the man's actions began to settle in. The general, however, remained calm and composed. He had no intention of letting this incident disrupt his peace any longer. He wasn't going to waste energy on someone who clearly didn't understand the deeper implications of his behavior. But even as he tried to focus on his reading, he couldn't help but notice the man's increasingly nervous demeanor. It was as if the man had suddenly realized that his assumptions had been completely wrong. After what felt like an eternity of silence, the man finally spoke. He turned in his seat and almost reluctantly addressed the general. I owe you an apology, he said, his voice unsure and hesitant. The general glanced at him briefly but didn't react right away. The apology felt awkward, almost forced, and there was something in the man's voice that suggested he wasn't truly sorry for what he had said. It was more of an attempt to ease his own discomfort than a genuine acknowledgement of his mistake. The general remained silent for a moment, his eyes studying the man, weighing the sincerity of his words. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. His voice was steady, but there was an underlying strength to it that made his words even more powerful. An apology is a start, he said calmly, but it doesn't erase what was said or how it made others feel. The man, visibly taken aback by the response, looked down at his hands, fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. He seemed to be processing the general's words, trying to find the right way to respond. I didn't mean it like that, the man stammered, looking for an excuse. It was just a thoughtless comment. I didn't know. His words trailed off as he realized that nothing he said could take back the words he had already spoken. The general gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. We often say things without thinking, he said, but the impact of those words can last much longer than we expect. The man looked at the general, his expression softening. He seemed to finally understand that this wasn't just about a seat on an airplane. It was about respect, about the assumptions we make about others based on their appearance or status. The general's calm and measured response had made it clear that it wasn't the words themselves, but the attitude behind them that had caused harm. And now, for the first time, the man seemed to be genuinely reflecting on that. I am truly sorry, he said again, this time with more sincerity. I shouldn't have said what I did. I was wrong. The general nodded once more, acknowledging the apology, but he knew that words alone wouldn't solve everything. It was in the actions that followed where true change would take place. It's not for me to decide if your apology is enough, the general replied. But it's a step forward. It's about understanding that we all have a responsibility to treat each other with dignity, no matter who we are. The man sat in silence for a moment, taking in the general's words. He seemed to be reflecting on the conversation, perhaps thinking about his own behavior and how it might have been influenced by his own biases. The general could see that the man was genuinely trying to understand, and that was all he could ask for. It wasn't about winning an argument or proving a point. It was about planting a seed of reflection, one that might grow into something more meaningful in the future. As the flight continued, the conversation shifted, and the man fell quiet. The general, for his part, went back to his book, his calm exterior betraying none of the internal thoughts that were running through his mind. He knew that the journey wasn't just about getting from one place to another. It was also about the encounters we have along the way, the moments that challenge us and force us to confront our assumptions and prejudices. And sometimes, those moments, no matter how small, could have a lasting impact on how we view the world and, more importantly, how we treat the people in it. The flight continued on, and the hours seemed to stretch out, each moment filled with an undercurrent of reflection. The man, who had been so quick to judge and make assumptions earlier, was now much quieter. He sat in his seat, occasionally looking out the window, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. The general, on the other hand, had returned to his calm, collected state. He had said his piece, and now there was nothing more to do but wait for the journey to end. Yet, despite the quiet around them, the tension was far from gone. As the plane cruised through the clouds, the flight attendants came by to offer refreshments. The general politely declined, still lost in his thoughts. He glanced once more at the man across the aisle. The man caught his gaze, but quickly looked away, as if ashamed. There was something different in the way the man now carried himself. The cocky, self-assured attitude from before had vanished, replaced by a humbler, more reflective demeanor. He didn't seem to know how to handle the situation, and that discomfort was evident. For the general, it wasn't about feeling vindicated. It was about sending a message. He knew that actions spoke louder than words. He had not raised his voice, nor had he become confrontational. He had simply shown the man what it meant to treat others with respect. It wasn't always necessary to engage in an argument or to defend yourself aggressively. Sometimes, just holding onto your dignity in the face of ignorance was the most powerful response. The general's calm had an effect on the other passengers too. They had been watching, some pretending not to notice, others more openly paying attention. The quiet confidence of the general had set a tone that now seemed to ripple through the cabin. The man who had caused the problem earlier could no longer pretend to be the center of attention. His behavior had placed a spotlight on his own insecurities, and the others were starting to notice. It was as if a collective realization had occurred. People were beginning to see the arrogance and the assumptions that had fueled the incident, and it made them uncomfortable. After a while, the man turned toward the general once more, a hesitant look on his face. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out at first. The general gave him a small, polite nod, silently inviting him to continue if he wished. The man took a deep breath, then spoke softly, his voice tinged with regret. "I know I can't take back what I said earlier," he began, his tone noticeably more sincere. "And I know that just saying sorry isn't enough, but I wanted to say it anyway. I really am sorry for the way I acted." His words seemed genuine, though still laced with uncertainty. The general studied him for a moment, his expression unchanged. The general nodded slowly, acknowledging the apology without judgment. "It's a start," he replied, his voice steady. "But real change comes with actions, not just words." The man nodded, a look of understanding in his eyes. It was clear he was beginning to grasp the deeper lesson the general had shared, even if he wasn't quite sure how to put it into practice yet. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but rather contemplative. Both men sat in their seats, lost in thought, as the plane continued its journey through the sky. The passengers around them went back to their quiet activities, but something had shifted. The atmosphere was no longer the same as it had been at the beginning of the flight. There was a sense of quiet respect now, not just for the general, but for the situation that had unfolded. Even the flight attendants seemed more aware of their surroundings, giving the general a respectful smile as they passed by. As the flight neared its destination, the general felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The journey had been more than just a flight from one place to another. It had been an opportunity for growth. both for him and for the man who had been so quick to judge. In the end, the general knew that the lesson wasn't something that could be taught in one conversation or fixed with a simple apology. It was a process, a journey of understanding that often took time. But the first step had been taken, and that was enough for now. The general didn't need to see the man change overnight, but he hoped that one day he would look back on this moment and understand the importance of treating others with dignity and respect. And that, in itself, was a victory. As the flight drew closer to its destination, the general couldn't help but reflect on the events of the past few hours. He looked out the window, watching the clouds drift past, his mind wandering. The incident had been resolved, but the conversation with the man lingered in his thoughts. He wasn't angry or upset, but he did wonder how long it would take for the man to fully understand the lesson that had been imparted. In a world full of assumptions and quick judgments, how often did people stop to think before they spoke? The general knew that some people never learned, that their biases were too ingrained to be changed by a single encounter. But he also believed that everyone had the potential for growth, even if it took time. Today, the man had been confronted with his own actions in a way that couldn't be ignored. The general had seen this kind of moment before in his military career, when a soldier made a mistake, and it took a hard lesson to realize the impact of their actions. Sometimes, change didn't come quickly, but it was often the result of these quiet, pivotal moments. As the plane began its descent, the man across the aisle seemed to grow more restless. He shifted in his seat, his eyes scanning the cabin nervously. He was clearly trying to avoid making eye contact with the general, but it was becoming harder for him to escape the reality of what had happened. The general, however, continued to sit calmly, his face composed. He wasn't going to make the man feel worse than he already did. There was no need for further confrontation. The general had done what he needed to do, and now it was up to the man to reflect on his own behavior. For the other passengers, the flight was nearly over, and the quiet hum of the plane was interrupted by the occasional announcements from the flight attendants. Some of them smiled at the general as they passed by, their gestures filled with appreciation for how he had handled the situation. They had witnessed what had unfolded, and though they hadn't said anything directly, it was clear that they respected him. It was a subtle acknowledgement of what had taken place, a quiet recognition of the strength it took to remain calm and composed in the face of disrespect. The man finally glanced over at the general, his face filled with a mix of guilt and uncertainty. He opened his mouth to say something but hesitated. The general looked at him for a brief moment before offering a slight nod. It wasn't an invitation to speak, but a simple acknowledgement that the man could choose his next words carefully. The man swallowed hard, then spoke softly, almost to himself. "I really don't know what came over me earlier," he muttered, as if trying to make sense of his actions. "I guess I just assumed." His words trailed off, but the sincerity in his voice was clear. The general nodded once again, understanding the struggle the man was facing. Sometimes, the hardest part wasn't admitting fault. It was accepting that we all had biases, and that overcoming them took time and effort. "We all make assumptions," the general said, his voice steady but not unkind. "It's part of being human, but it's how we respond to them that matters." The man nodded, his eyes reflecting a newfound understanding. He seemed to appreciate the general's words, even though he knew it wasn't enough to undo what had already been said. The general wasn't asking for an apology anymore. What mattered now was the man's willingness to change, to recognize the hurt he had caused and take steps to be more mindful in the future. As the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign blinked off, the passengers began to gather their things, preparing for the end of the flight. The general stood up, gathering his belongings. He didn't look at the man again, but he could sense the shift in the air. The man wasn't the same person who had made the rude comment at the beginning of the flight. Whether or not he would change permanently remained to be seen. But for now, the general had done his part. The lesson had been planted, and the rest was up to the man. As the passengers filed out of the plane, the general walked down the aisle, his head held high, a quiet sense of satisfaction in his step. He had handled the situation with dignity. And now, as he stepped off the plane, he knew that this moment would stay with him, just as it would stay with a man who had learned an important lesson in humility and respect. The world wasn't perfect, but small moments like these, when someone was willing to learn from their mistakes, made it a little better. As the general made his way through the terminal, he couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. The flight had been long, and though the circumstances had been less than ideal, the lesson was clear. Not every confrontation had to end in conflict. Sometimes, the most powerful change came in the most subtle of ways. The general knew this wasn't a moment that would change the world overnight, but perhaps it had changed something in the man who had spoken out of turn. It was a small victory, but one that was worth something. The terminal was bustling with activity as passengers disembarked, heading to their destinations. But for the general, the journey was far from over. He still had a meeting to attend, but his thoughts lingered on the encounter he had just experienced. He wondered if the man would carry the lesson with him, or if it would fade into the background of his busy life. But that was not the general's concern. He had done what he could. The rest was up to the man. As he walked past the baggage claim area, the general couldn't help but overhear the quiet murmurs of a few other passengers. Some were still talking about the situation that had unfolded in first class, though no one dared to speak too loudly. The general knew they were all aware of what had happened, and while they didn't speak of it openly, he could sense a shift in how they viewed him. They had witnessed the way he handled the situation, and whether they realized it or not, it had left an impression on them. The incident, while seemingly small in the grand scheme of things, had shown the power of patience and self-respect. The general hadn't needed to make a scene. He hadn't needed to shout or argue. His quiet strength had spoken volumes. It wasn't just about winning a confrontation. It was about teaching others what true dignity looked like. It was about standing firm in your beliefs without having to prove anything to anyone. It was about choosing to respond with respect, even when it wasn't given to you in return. As the general reached the exit, he paused for a moment, glancing back over his shoulder. The man who had made the rude comments was still in the terminal, walking toward the baggage claim. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and for the first time, the man offered a small, genuine nod. It wasn't an apology, but it didn't need to be. It was an acknowledgement, a silent recognition of the lesson learned. The general returned the nod with a small, respectful gesture of his own before turning to leave. For a moment, the world felt a little quieter. The general walked out into the bright daylight, his thoughts still on the man and the encounter. He knew that moments like this were rare, and they often passed unnoticed by the rest of the world. But for the general, it was enough. He had shown the man a better way, and now it was up to him to walk that path. As he walked away, the general knew that there would be more challenges ahead. The world wasn't perfect, and people would always have their biases. But the general believed in the power of quiet strength, in the ability to change hearts and minds without force or violence. It was a lesson that would stay with him, just as it would stay with the man who had made the mistake. The general didn't need recognition. He didn't need thanks. He simply needed to know that in that moment, he had made a difference, not just for himself, but for someone else. And that, in the end, was what mattered most. The world wasn't changed by grand gestures or loud speeches. It was changed by the quiet moments, the ones where people chose to rise above and do what was right, even when no one was watching.